The professor thought making fun of Melania Trump would be just another classroom joke. But when Barron stood up, his response left the entire room in stunned silence. The lecture hall at Brown University was a place where ideas clashed, where young minds were sharpened by debate and the occasional controversy. The auditorium-style room, with its sleek wooden desks and towering whiteboards, had seen countless discussions on policy, history, and leadership. But today the focus wasn't on global affairs or constitutional law. It was personal. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, a tenured professor in the political science department, paced across the front of the room. He was known for his charismatic lectures, his ability to keep students engaged, not just through facts and analysis, but through his signature brand of sarcasm. He paused at the podium, adjusting his glasses with a casual flick of his fingers. Behind him, the massive screen displayed an image of Melania Trump at a diplomatic event. Her expression poised, her posture graceful. But the professor's smirk suggested he wasn't about to launch into praise. "And here," Dr. Whitmore began, gesturing toward the screen, "we have an example of what some might call success. A woman who found herself at the center of global politics, not because of her achievements, not because of her intellect, but because she stood next to the right man at the right time." A few chuckles echoed across the room. Some students immediately looked up from their laptops, sensing something entertaining was coming. Others continued taking notes, unfazed. At the back of the hall, Barron Trump sat in silence. He had learned to tune out the noise a long time ago. The assumptions, the mockery, the headlines written by people who never actually knew his mother. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of his notebook. His expression was unreadable. But beneath the desk, his hands clenched. Dr. Whitmore continued, stepping away from the podium and pacing the stage. "Now, before anyone accuses me of being unfair, let's look at the facts. What do we know about Melania Trump?" He glanced at the audience, waiting. Silence. A few students exchanged looks, hesitant to speak. "Exactly," he said, snapping his fingers. "Nothing of substance. She was a model, a reluctant first lady. And let's not forget the Be Best campaign, because nothing says tackling cyberbullying like being married to the most famous Twitter user of all time." This time, laughter rippled through the room. Some students chuckled openly, their shoulders shaking. Others smirked, looking down at their desks, avoiding eye contact with a certain someone sitting in the back. Barron inhaled slowly through his nose. He had heard it all before. The dismissals, the jokes. People liked to pretend his mother was nothing but an ornament. Dr. Whitmore pressed forward, emboldened by the reaction. "Now, don't get me wrong," he said, feigning seriousness. "I'm sure she's very kind. But let's be honest. She didn't write policy. She didn't negotiate treaties. She didn't— what's the word? Contribute?" More laughter. Louder this time. A few students turned slightly in their seats. Some, out of curiosity, glanced toward Barron as if expecting to see a reaction. But Barron didn't move. His expression remained still, his hands now clasped together in front of him. The professor, still basking in the moment, turned back to the screen. He tapped his pointer against the image. "I mean, let's give credit where it's due. She certainly knew how to pose for a camera. And in Washington, that's apparently enough." A wave of laughter swept through the hall. Barron could feel the weight of it pressing against his ears. The way some students laughed a little too hard. The way others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. For years, he had let moments like these pass. He had ignored the headlines, the late-night talk show jokes, the so-called intellectuals who thought reducing his mother to a stereotype made them sound clever. But this time, something inside him shifted, and the professor had no idea what was coming next. For a moment, the laughter filled every corner of the lecture hall. The kind of laughter that wasn't just amusement, but something more, dismissive, condescending, the kind that made a statement. A few students chuckled as they leaned back in their chairs. Others exchanged quick glances, not entirely sure if they should be laughing. Some seemed entertained, enjoying the professor's boldness. A handful, however, stayed quiet, their gazes shifting toward the back of the room, toward Barron. He sat there, Still. Not a single movement. No shift in posture, no change in expression. But the tension in his body had changed. His hands, now locked together, were rigid. A girl in the second row leaned toward her friend, lowering her voice. "Does he not realize Barron's sitting right there?" Her friend hesitated before answering. "He knows. He's banking on him staying quiet." That was the thing about Barron. People always assumed he wouldn't say anything, that he'd let it slide, just like he always had. And for a second it looked like they were right. Dr. Whitmore, basking in the reaction, clasped his hands together, looking amused. "Ah, but perhaps I'm being too harsh," he mused, his voice dripping with mock reflection. "Maybe there's more to the story. Maybe she's a modern-day Eleanor Roosevelt, a true intellectual powerhouse. Maybe she's written groundbreaking policy. Oh, wait." He let the silence drag for a moment, then chuckled, shaking his head. "Never mind. That would require having something to say." The laughter spiked, louder than before, more confident now. Some students slapped their desks, enjoying the performance. Others smirked, murmuring to each other. But in the back row, Barron shifted. It wasn't much. Just a slow lean forward, his forearms resting on the desk in front of him. His face, unreadable moments before, had hardened slightly. A subtle change, but a heavy one. Dr. Whitmore, mid-smirk, caught the movement. His eyes flickered toward the back of the room for a split second. A tiny pause. A hesitation that wasn't there before. And for the first time he realized what he had done. But it was too late to take it back. The laughter hadn't even fully died down when Barron pushed his chair back. The soft scrape of wood against the floor barely made a sound over the lingering chuckles. But it was enough. Enough to make a few heads turn. Enough to make the laughter taper off just slightly. Then he stood up. All 6'7" of him. A shift rippled through the room, not from anything he said, not yet, but simply from the sheer presence of him standing there, unmoving, unwavering. Dr. Whitmore hesitated. For the first time in the lecture, his confidence wavered, just slightly. He was used to control, used to being the one who dictated the flow of the conversation. But now, the energy had changed. Barron let the silence stretch for a moment longer, letting everyone feel it. Then his voice, steady, clear, and calm, cut through the room. "You know nothing about my mother." The professor blinked. A few students shifted in their seats. Barron wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't flustered. If anything, his tone was measured, as if he had thought through every word before even opening his mouth. "She speaks 5 languages fluently. English is her 5th, and she speaks it better than most people in this room." His eyes, sharp and unwavering, swept across the students. Some of them immediately looked down at their desks. "She built a career for herself before she ever met my father. Not just as a model, but as an independent businesswoman, something that people like you conveniently forget." Dr. Whitmore opened his mouth, maybe to interrupt, maybe to push back, but Barron didn't stop. "She didn't campaign to be First Lady. She never asked for it. But when she was, she handled it with grace. She didn't need the attention. She didn't crave the spotlight. She used her position to advocate for children because she actually cared. Not for the cameras, not for power, just because she believed it was the right thing to do." Silence. The room, just minutes ago full of laughter, had shifted into something else entirely. Dr. Whitmore, for the first time, wasn't smiling. "But I get it," Barron continued, tilting his head slightly. "It's easy, isn't it? To sit up there, make jokes about a woman you've never met, a life you don't understand, because it makes you look smart, makes you look clever. You think it gives you power." A few students held their breath. Barron took a step forward. Not aggressive, not threatening, just deliberate. "But the truth is, it's lazy." His voice was softer now, but somehow it hit harder. Because tearing someone down is always the easiest thing to do. Dr. Whitmore had no words. Neither did anyone else. But the impact was undeniable. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Not the kind of silence that happens when people lose interest. No. This was the kind that made people sit up straighter, breathe a little slower, feel the weight of something shifting right in front of them. Dr. Whitmore stood frozen, one hand still resting on the podium. The smirk he had worn just moments ago was nowhere to be seen. He wasn't used to being challenged, at least not like this. His lectures were performances, his words designed to be the final say in any discussion. But now, in the face of a student who refused to play along, he had nothing. Not a quip, not a sarcastic retort. Nothing. And the rest of the room felt it. Some students stared down at their desks, suddenly invested in their notes. A few shifted in their seats, casting quick glances toward Barron and the professor, trying to gauge where this was going. Others, however, looked at Barron differently, not as the son of a president, not as some tabloid headline, but as a man who had just done what so many others never did. He spoke up. Then, somewhere near the center of the room, a single, deliberate clap. Not rushed, not performative, just one student breaking the stillness, then another, and another. Within seconds, half the room was clapping. It wasn't the thunderous, over-the-top applause you'd hear at a rally or a sporting event. It was something quieter, more meaningful. The kind of applause people give when they recognize something that actually mattered. And Dr. Whitmore knew it. The professor's eyes darted across the room, watching as more and more students joined in. Not everyone did. Some sat motionless, arms crossed, lips pressed together, but enough that the message was clear. This wasn't just about Melania Trump anymore. This was about a line being crossed, about someone finally saying what no one else had dared to. Barron didn't soak in the applause. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, letting it settle, letting it sink in. Then, as if deciding his part in this was over, he picked up his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and turned toward the exit. As he passed by rows of students, a few of them met his gaze. Some gave small, barely noticeable nods. Others looked at him with something that might have been respect, or maybe just a kind of awe. By the time he reached the door, Dr. Whitmore finally found his voice. He cleared his throat, forcing a tight smile. "All right, let's move on." But it wasn't the same. His voice didn't carry the weight it had before. His authority, the unquestioned dominance he held over the lecture hall, had been cracked. Maybe just a little. But everyone had seen it happen. And what happened after class would leave an even bigger mark. The door swung shut behind Barron, cutting off the last remnants of applause. But inside the lecture hall, the energy hadn't settled. Some students still sat in stunned silence, their minds replaying what had just happened. Others leaned toward their friends, whispering in hushed voices. Did that actually just happen? I've never seen Whitmore shut down like that. I didn't even know Barron talked. At the front of the room, Dr. Whitmore adjusted his tie, his composure returning in small, controlled movements. He forced a chuckle, trying to reclaim his grip on the class. "Well," he said, "that was unexpected, but let's get back on track." His voice was calm, even confident, but it no longer carried the same undisputed authority. He knew it. They all did. And that was the real shift. For years, Dr. Whitmore had built his reputation as untouchable, a man who could say whatever he wanted under the guise of intellectual discourse. But for the first time, someone had pushed back in a way he couldn't ignore. And worse, people had listened. Outside the lecture hall, Barron didn't slow down. He walked with a measured pace, his bag slung over one shoulder, his mind clear. He wasn't angry. Not really. He had expected the jokes, expected the smug commentary. What he hadn't expected was how easy it had been to shut it down. Not with outrage, not with emotion, but with truth. As he rounded the corner, a voice called out behind him. "Hey, Barron, wait up!" He stopped, turning slightly. A group of students, 3 guys, 2 girls, hurried toward him. He recognized a few of them from previous lectures. One of the guys, a tall, broad-shouldered sophomore named Liam, was the first to speak. "Dude," Liam said, shaking his head. "That was insane. I've never seen anyone shut Whitmore down like that." One of the girls, Sophie, pushed her glasses up her nose. "Honestly, I always thought he was kind of full of himself, but no one ever called him out before." Another student, Isaiah, let out a short laugh. "Man, the way you said you know nothing about my mother, that hit different." Barron shrugged. I just said what needed to be said. There was a pause, the kind that meant something more. Then Liam grinned. Yeah, well, you earned my respect today, man. The others nodded. And just like that, a silent understanding passed between them. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about name recognition. It was about standing up when it mattered. For the first time since walking into that class, Barron felt something unexpected. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something deeper. Something earned. But this moment wouldn't just stay in that hallway. It was about to spread much further than anyone expected. By the time Barron got back to his dorm, his phone was blowing up. Text messages. Missed calls. A flood of notifications. His name was all over campus group chats. Someone had recorded the moment in class, and now clips of him shutting down Dr. Whitmore were making the rounds online. At first, he considered ignoring it. He wasn't interested in being a viral moment. He hadn't spoken up for attention. He had spoken up because it was the right thing to do. But as he scrolled through the messages, something caught his eye. A DM from someone he didn't know. I'm not a fan of your family, but today you earned my respect. He clicked to the next message. My mom was an immigrant too. People act like she's less than because of her accent. Thanks for saying something. Another one. I used to laugh at jokes like that. Today made me think twice. You're right. It's lazy. He set the phone down, staring at the wall for a moment. It wasn't about winning an argument. It wasn't about proving a professor wrong. It was about how quickly people accept tearing others down as normal, and how sometimes it only takes one voice to change that. The next class with Dr. Whitmore was different. He still lectured with confidence. He still made bold statements. But he didn't crack jokes about Melania Trump. He didn't use cheap shots to get a laugh. Maybe he learned something that day. Maybe he didn't. But everyone else did. And that was enough. Sometimes, the world tells you to stay quiet, to let things slide, to let people believe what they want to believe. But respect isn't given, it's earned. And when you speak the truth, not just to argue, but because it needs to be said, people listen, even the ones who weren't ready to hear it. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Because sometimes, one voice is all it takes.